All right, good afternoon and welcome to John Box Watercolor. Today we're going to be talking all about trees. But before we get started, if you wouldn't mind giving this video a thumbs up, and if you like what you see, consider subscribing. All right, so I've been getting a lot of questions about painting trees and foliage, and so I wanted to make a video on how that is done. First, I'm going to kind of demonstrate what I see a lot of individuals do when they're first starting out in watercolor, and then we're going to kind of move on to what techniques you should be using, and we're going to apply that technique to make 3 different species of tree over here. All right, so whenever you're making a tree, I tend to see individuals use a very vertical brush, and what they tend to do is they kind of make marks like this, where if I was making a spruce type shape or kind of a Christmas tree, they would do something like that and kind of push their brush and flick it down. They would do the same thing for if we were doing an oak or an elm, which is sort of that round shape of tree. So they might kind of move their brush like this, try to get somewhat of a round shape here, and then pull a trunk down. Now, the issue with this is that when we look at natural trees and natural foliage, you're always going to have gaps of light leaking through the foliage and leaves. And if you see here, there's a couple of like little dots here in this tree, and there's some larger ones here, but it's not very natural looking. What we want to do to get those broken edges and kind of that more natural look is we want to take our brush and we want to use it at an angle here, almost completely flat to the paper. I'll actually lay my brush down on the paper and then slowly push down on the brush head to barely make contact here. And it can make it a little easier if beforehand you push your brush into your pail so that it has, I don't know if you can see that, just a little bit of an up angle on the end there. But what we're looking to do here is I just want to barely touch the paper, and you'll see if I'm building kind of a round shape here, that we get a much more natural and broken look to our foliage. And all we have to do from here is we can pull a trunk down and draw, you know, if we want a shadow or something like that. But that's the first step to creating more realistic trees, is we want to be using this brush on an angle. Now, it's going to be easier if you have very rough paper like I do. I typically use Arch 300 grain rough paper. And the rougher it is, it has those little bumps and things sticking up. So it's easier to get these little flecks and inflections of light and paint when you're working. If you have hot press paper, it's going to be very smooth. You can still get away with it. You're just going to have to be very gentle with how you sort of angle that brush up and down on the paper. So that's kind of our first step in how we get the shape of the foliage, but then let's also talk about what we want to do to make it a little more realistic. So I'm going to spray my paper and let's just work on this tree shape we have. Now, I often see beginners sort of do something like this up here and then they leave it alone. But if you look at a tree, you're going to have variations in tonality and color within that foliage, especially down towards the base. And I want to do this while it's still wet, but what I'm going to do is mix up a darker and thicker wash of pigment here. And I'm just going to dab my brush. I'm just touching around the bottom of that tree just to get a little bit of a darker tone down there. And I'll see a lot of people where they'll start to do this and maybe it doesn't quite blend quickly enough. You want to give your watercolor time to move. If you go to put dots in this tree and it doesn't spread out very quickly, or it kind of just leaves a random, like I'll put one up here, a dot like that, leave it alone and don't mess with it. Give it a good 2 minutes before you decide, okay, that needs a little work. Watercolor needs to be left alone. And you'll see, even as we sit here, that dot slowly starts to spread out, and it will continue to do so if you've got if you've done this while your paint is wet for a few minutes. You've got to give it time. All right, so again, that would be our step 2 there, is darkening the foliage towards the bottom. We want to get that transition of light to dark. We want to have those breaks through the tree. The next thing I'm going to talk about is limb structure. And so let's grab, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll grab a little yellow here, and you can use this. The reason I like this technique so much is that just by varying the trunk shape, the color of your foliage, and sort of the shape of your foliage, you can create different species of trees in different seasons, and it's very easy to do. It's really one technique to sort of rule them all. So I've got some yellow ochre here. This is going to be, that's a little darker than I'd like. I want to have somewhat of a fall tree going here. I'm going to grab some Hansa yellow medium, make this a little bit more wet. And I think that's going to be a little too green, so maybe this will be more of a spring-like tree. And you'll see I'm using my brush on the edge there. That is, you're going to see that throughout this technique. You've got to have that brush laid flat and on its edge. So if I had a tree like this, and I'll take and pull a trunk up here, something like that. And I want to add, I'll throw a little shadow there, and I want to add some limbs to it. What I like to do as kind of a neat little trick is actually take your brush. You need a fairly small brush. You want to put it in your offhand. And what this will allow you to do is, for most people, you're going to be a little bit more wiggly and loose in your offhand. In painting realistic trees, especially anything in nature, comes from that ability to stay loose. And so I'll just pull some limbs out from the foliage there. And just let my left hand just kind of wiggle and create just a couple of little kind of abstract nuances, let's say. Okay. Let's put a split there. If you're going to do a larger limb, you can use your dominant hand to create maybe some kind of a split there. But that's the basic idea of how we want to be creating trees and moving from something like this to something like this. So over here on the right side of my paper, I've got 3 boxes. In each box, we're going to do a different species of tree just to demonstrate how this sort of technique can sort of be a one-stop shop for creating trees and plants. So we're going to start first with a spruce tree up here, which is what you think of, that kind of classic Christmas tree shape. So I'm going to mix up, I had a fairly yellowy mixture here. I'm going to add in some cobalt and cerulean to darken it up. And let's do a patch of Christmas trees. So I'm going to mush my brush down. I'm going to get that angle. I'm going to lay it flat on the paper. And I'm going to start to work getting wider and wider towards the base here, and we're going to create some Christmas trees here. And this would be a perfect thing for if, you know, you were doing the edge of a forest or some woods, or maybe you're painting an actual little Christmas tree farm or something. This is exactly how we would want to do that. And that one's that's a little wonky. I'll just make it a little taller. Maybe put one just there in the back there. But that's exactly how I would do that. And then if I wanted to, I could pull some trunks down. Now with spruce, I don't really want to add any limbs in here, but that's the basic idea in terms of the color we want to use. And again, you're going to see me just laying this brush right on its side. And I'm not getting much paint there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn this over. If I want more paint, I push further down onto the paper there. And so I'll lift up just a little bit, work it, and as I move towards the top, I'll back off a little bit. But that's basically how you get, if you wanted to do kind of a spruce tree line, maybe something in the snow, something to that effect, okay? All right, next we're gonna do is an umbrella pine. And this type of tree has a fairly long and tall trunk with most of your foliage being horizontal and at the very top of the tree. This is something that you might see. The shape reminds me of some different trees, like in Africa, or if you're in the southern parts of the United States, specifically the southeast and the savanna, the kind of swamp areas. This is the type of tree you might see. I'm going to warm up my paint just a little bit here. And I should also mention that the thicker you have your paint, that can also make it easier if you happen to have that warm press paper. The more watery you get, the more it's going to want to just run out and not hold those little flecks that we're looking for. So again, the shape of the foliage here is going to be horizontal, and so I want to go ahead and put my brush in a horizontal fashion as well. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to scoot my palette over here just so I've got room to lay my brush down and push that off camera. I'm going to put it on its side, and I'm just going to start to work in that very sort of horizontal fashion. And I'm going to do just something simple like that. All right. And how this would look, if I were to pull a trunk here, I'm going to grab my smaller brush. And in this instance, I'm not really going for too much abstraction, so I'm going to put it in more of my dominant hand here. Okay. But that's the type of species of tree where, if you can see now, we're going to have that longer trunk shape. And maybe just a little bit of that push out there. And it kind of layers on top of the tree. All right. Very simple to do. I can pull a couple of little things there. If I wanted to give this tree a neighbor, do the same thing. Work in this horizontal fashion. Maybe this one's a little bit shorter of a tree. And typically, you want to pull your trunks up from the bottom to the top, because you always want that base to be a little wider and stronger, and then sort of thin out and dissipate as you work towards the top. Okay. Add a little bit of water to my palette. I can scoot this back into frame. All right. But there we go. That's how you would create that species of tree. Some shadows, little things in the background there. It doesn't take much just to start building up somewhat of a little forest scene. Okay. Now, finally, we're going to do an elm tree, which is that classic kind of round shape, very similar to this here. And we're going to do it in the fall. And how we're going to do that is, I often see a lot of individuals, if they're doing fall foliage, they'll do this type of shape, and they might start off with a yellow. This is a yellow ochre. And then they'll grab a different color yellow, grab some red, and it ends up sort of looking like apples or something. It doesn't read very well, because if you look at a fall tree, yes, there's going to be a variation of warmer and cooler leaves, kind of ranging from that muddy orange to yellow and red. But when you look at the tree as a whole, they're not quite isolated like that. So I like to do it a little bit differently. What I like to do is, using this same technique, I'll start out the little yellow here. Let's warm that up just a little bit. Add a little burnt sienna. Same process. I'm going to lay my brush over on the side. And what I might do is, I'll do just that much there. Then, in a separate pail, I'll create a little bit more of a reddish batch. And I'll start to work that in. Okay? And I'll work back and forth here, but you're not going to see me going in and dabbing little dots of leaves into our foliage. I'm going to build it all up with this sideways brush shape. And again, I'm just going to pull my trunk up here, start wide, pull it up into the tree there. Maybe you create a little split. And this is the type of tree where, if you wanted to, you could do some more abstract type limbs, where I'll put the brush in my offhand and just pull a couple of shapes out of the tree there. But you really want to be careful when it comes to your limbs. You don't want to go overboard. So it'll be something like that. And this is where we would come and work in here. Be very our tonality of our, that needs to be a little bit wetter. All right, let's get kind of a darker, warm color here. Darken the bottom. And this is a really good example of where I see a lot of people panic. They'll put those kind of darker dots in there. It didn't quite blend and they'll start trying to work on it. Leave it alone. Give it a good 2 to 3 minutes to spread out. And as you sit here on camera, you'll start to see this spread out. Before I even touch it with a brush, I'll just give it a little spray of water and leave it alone. So many watercolors have been ruined by overworking things. You want to just leave them alone. I might darken this side of the trunk here, but I'm going to leave that foliage all alone. And look at that. It's completely spread out. You can't see those dots anymore. That's what it takes, just a little bit of time, a little spray of water, but no brushwork. The more you can let watercolor do its own thing, the better. So, just to recap here, again, the secret to good trees, it's going to be that sideways brush. It's going to be working with rougher paper. And again, if you've got that warm or hot press paper, you can do this. Just got to be really careful. Just keep it very flat and work it slow. Okay, but that's what's going to let us get all of these nice little breaks and really give a more realistic impression. But most of all, it's easier to do. I'm all about painting things easy, and that versus that is a huge difference, and they took the same amount of time. But to be quite frank, I mean, this is very easy. I just had a yellow mix and a red mix and just worked the brush on its side. So if you stayed with me all the way to the end, I really appreciate it. If you haven't, consider giving this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. I'm going to try to have 3 to 4 new videos coming out each week. So remember to keep on painting. Thanks.